Welcome to the Integral Stage and to the continuation of our exploration of the Kosmos Trilogy, this time focusing on Excerpt D, the look of a feeling. And I'm here with one of my favorite trans laws, as opposed to outlaws, Layman Pascal. Welcome, Layman.
Howdy, Bruce.
Yeah, good to be here with you. Yeah, I noticed at the end of this excerpt, he waxes poetic and gets into a lot of alliteration, but he lays out a few phrases that I think are a good way to look at how he sees this particular excerpt playing a role in the cosmic picture. You know, he was talking about the outside of interiors, you know, that this is a map of the outside of the interior. So he described it as a map of the soul, a charter of the far reaches of consciousness, an atlas of Atman, drafts of the divine, that kind of thing. So I think he's wanting to really plug this, what could be very technical and postmodern and modernist kind of reflections within this larger cosmic integral framing. And so I just wanted to name that up front. But yeah, I think we could take a little time to just lay out our impressions of what this excerpt is about and what it covers. And then I hope we can go into some more fine details and see where that takes us.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in this seemingly straightforward text, and clearly we won't get to all of it in an hour or two, but we can at least dig around and get our hands dirty. For me, even the title, The Look of a Feeling, is something that needs to be teased apart, because on the one hand, it's an artful indication that the main focus is going to be the objective gaze upon the personal and shared interior modes of experience. But there's already, even if only poetically, something there where he's conflating this with optics and emotions, right? Is there or is there not an implication here that the third person modes are like the eyes and the first and second person modes are like feelings, right? There's a lot of subtle things here that I want to tease apart. I'll put that aside. We'll come back to some of my questions from last time. This text continues Wilber's thrust throughout the excerpts of simultaneously exploring his take on integral post-metaphysics and his proposal that adding an inside and outside to each quadrant is a powerful explanatory tool.
Right.
And in this text, what struck me is he's making a kind of intelligibility loop where he says basically integral methodological pluralism predicts structuralism. That is to say, it specifies there must be a zone of serious philosophical inquiry operating as if outside phenomenological and hermeneutic inquiries, but nonetheless pertaining to the same territory, though inspecting it as though it were object-like dynamics. So he's going to dive into structuralists and post-structuralists here and emphasize their attempt to distinguish themselves from hermeneuticists and phenomenologists. But then he's going to say there's some limits on how they do structuralism. They don't comprehensively theorize its relations to other methodologies, and they only have a clumsy notion of the progress of the epistemes. So he's going to propose that integral metatheory is essentially an adequate structuralism for a change. And he uses that phrase a lot. I like the phrase adequate structuralism, but if integral says there must be structuralism and structuralism only works if it's integral, that's very tidy.
Yeah, I thought he gave at the beginning of the excerpts a good overview of territory covered so far and a good description of integral post-metaphysics and the zones. And one of the takeaways I had for his discussion of integral post-metaphysics, because I think it relates also to the religion that's not a religion project, and that's been on my mind recently, is that, the integral post-metaphysical spiritual approach is basically looking to develop, an approach with an explanatory power, you could say a grounding and orienting power that's equal to those of the great metaphysical systems, but without their ontological baggage. And so I think that's going to be, something that we can take up with John Vervaeke in a few days when we're exploring the religions that's not a religion with him. And one of the first steps that he outlines is, to replace perceptions with perspectives, as we discussed, last discussion. And he describes that as a move from privileging abstract objects, to talk about perceptions is already to just identify one feature, one element, one concept that might be showing up within phenomenological space, and instead privileging sentient beings, those who are actually experiencing anything like a perception or anything else that we might name, experiencing something like water or whatever element that you want to focus on. So he sees it as a move from abstraction to embodiment. And I think you can quibble about that a little bit, but I think the point's well taken. And then, if you acknowledge that a good starting place for a world picture is with sentient beings, then you have to acknowledge that sentient beings take perspectives in their encounter with each other. And so then the project becomes, what are the kinds of perspectives that sentient beings take? And for him, the simple result is the quadrants, and then extrapolating on that a little bit and expanding, you get the 8 zones. So yeah, I thought that was a good place to start and set us on the next step of the journey. Because he, in excerpt C, he looked at I and we from the inside. And so that was basically phenomenology and hermeneutics. And now he's going to flip it and have us look at the I and the we from the outside. In the 4-zone model, this is zone 2. In the 8-zone model, these are zones 2 and 4.
Yeah, I thought, and this goes to what you were just saying, there's actually a really succinct overview of the post-metaphysics argument at the beginning of this text, right? Especially at its purpose, like when he talks about dignifying spiritual experience without requiring pre-modern interpretations. I think that's a really nice, succinct, clear statement, although I want to add also without requiring any particular modern interpretations of those experiences. His emphasis on shifting from perception to perspective, like you were saying, I think is essential. It's a crucial move. It's a way of describing the crucial move toward post-metaphysics. He's going to focus very much on these different zones, but I think there's an even more basic thing in there, which is just this sense that interpretive intercontextuality is built into reality. You're never going to get to the reality that's free of that, because that's implicit to the definition of reality, which is as much Buddhist as it is postmodern. Right? Even Atman and Brahman are interdependent co-arisings. So I think that's a really profound thing, and it's something that's not always really appreciated, even within the integral community. Because everybody sort of has a colloquial assumption that, okay, maybe my beliefs are imperfect and I could change my minds about things. But there's a much stronger claim here, that in a way, the Nietzschean claim that interpretation is already built into perception and cognition at the deepest level. You're never going to go high enough or deep enough or intense enough to have some experience that is not interactive and interpretive and lensed.
Right.
So for me, that's very exciting, right? That's the adjacency claim, that intercontextuality and necessary displacement of identity are foundational at all postmodern and meta-theoretical viewpoints. It's always reality tunnels relating to reality tunnels, because reality is dynamic interperspectuality. Yeah, and one last thing on the post-metaphysics part is, as I think we both believe, Wilber says it very clearly in the opening to this text, post-metaphysics is not anti-metaphysics.
Right.
I think he says that, what does he say? The crime of metaphysics is not that it deals with non-material aspects of reality, some of which exist and some of which don't, but the fact that it ignores the built-in nature of perspectives. So I think that's a really important thing. In some ways, it's very obvious, but people often slip past that. I can't tell you how many times I've had a discussion with someone where they've suddenly become worried that post-metaphysics means all metaphysics is being rejected in some modern sense. And I'm like, we've already had this discussion a dozen times. Post-metaphysics is not anti-metaphysics. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Right. Yeah. Implicit in that framing about the built-in intercontextuality and interpretive nature of any kind of experience is this fundamental questioning of the metaphysical presupposition of presence. the metaphysics of presence, which Heidegger and later Derrida and others focus on in their own ways. And so that is actually quite relevant to what we're talking about today with structuralism, because especially if you get into the post-structuralist and neo-structuralist elements that he explores in this excerpt, that's really the same as the deconstructive movement within postmodernism, which really wrestled with and tackled this belief in the sheer presence of things beyond the need for the presence to awareness of things beyond the need for any kind of interpretive engagement or perspective taking, in the apprehension. So from there, he after laying that out, he then begins to open up in many different ways. And on the one hand, it's kind of a very simple idea, but he unpacks it along several different trajectories, so we can maybe explore some of those. But basically, the idea that if you have this interior domain of experience, you can either experience it from the first person, where it's a knowledge by acquaintance. There's an immersion in it to some degree, or you can kind of take a step back and see it from the outside, look at it from a bit of a distance. And so if we're looking at it from the grammatology point of view, prepositionally, that's like a pivot from as to about, where as you are basically immersed in that experience to some degree and feeling from it. And then the other is you're acknowledging that that's present in the stream of experience, but you're taking a step back to look at its patterns, its behaviors, and have a little bit more of an objective take on it. So that's the very simple move that he says is involved with the emergence of zone 2, but it gets more complicated because there are other elements that are really involved in building up an adequate structural or post-structuralist account of what's going on and what the networks of influence are in any moment of experience.
Yeah, there's so much that can come out of what is essentially a very simple move where one lens is turned on another lens, where we're going to be about the as. Now, I'm going to be looking at how I experience things in my immediacy, or how we experience things in our immediacy. And, although this is downstream historically of the emergence of structural type disciplines, it is a nice feature of this map that it predicts there should be a space where those kinds of disciplines would arise, whether it's structuralist, ethnology or things like that, or whether it's psychodynamics, right? Freud is very much operating in this zone, because he's not asking you, as previous people might have done, or maybe even in the Foucauldian sense, the history of psychoanalysis in church confessionals. The church confessionals are asking you to tell your point of view, right? Whereas Freud is saying, look, your point of view is, when we look at through this other lens, an epiphenomenon, right? There's a set of structural dynamics. There's an id and an ego and a superego, and there's these relationships, and there's a boundary beyond which things enter the unconscious. He's looking at almost a mechanical third-person objective map. He's looking at it like it's machinery or, hydraulic tubes or something like that. And that's a very powerful way to look at it. And it's a way of looking that if you were just armed with this integral map, you would predict there would have to be disciplines like that, both for the study of the individual psyche and the study of our shared experience of meaning making. And there are things about that you're never going to find just by asking the people, so to speak. Right. One of the interesting things in this section is he comes back, as he's done in other sections, to the rules of chess. Right. So if you have a heightened phenomenology where a person is going to really pay more attention to the way they're perceiving things, they're going to bracket their assumptions about what those things are and access that immediate information to build up a richer field of personal experience, great. That person playing chess is not going to encounter the rules of chess. They're not. It's not going to arise for them as a phenomenon. And even if they're working out within their hermeneutic circle of intersubjectivity with the other person, this one looks like a horse. Don't you agree? Yes, I agree. This looks like a horse. Right? They're still not going to come across the actual layout of the rules of chess. Now, that's interesting because that's often an area where we might put it in the lower right quadrant of integral theory, generally looking at system dynamics. But you can do that kind of external move specifically to people's interior experience, and you're looking at the code, you're looking at the architecture, you're looking at the network map of what's going on, which is not how it appears to the people for whom the experience is occurring, but this is specifically about the experience that is occurring. And that's a fascinating conjunction and overlap.
It really is. Yeah, and thinking about the critique of the metaphysics of presence that you find in post-structuralism or deconstruction, and that integral post-metaphysics is carrying forward. Interestingly, if you look at how he's laying it out, it's not an absolute rejection of the metaphysics of presence. It's a contextualizing of it in a sense, to the degree that the first person is still formulated as a kind of knowledge by being, a knowledge by acquaintance, and there's a directness there, but it never can be fully disentangled from the interpretive about, and that's the tetra arising of all the quadrants. And so, in one way, you can look at it. I guess I would add there somebody like Hilary Putnam would say all of our experience is partially constructed or co-constructed, but we can't tease apart the unconstructed from the constructed. We can acknowledge that there is this kind of directness, this immersion, this knowledge by being, but anything that we go to say about it, it involves taking perspectives, and it involves ultimately an interpretive element, and you can't really slip outside of that. And so the play between these zone 1 and 2 domains, you really can't totally isolate them from each other, but it's a degree of differentiation of emphasis, I would say.
Yeah, I think there's the basic metaphysics of presence that people take advantage of, particularly of concern to me within spiritual and mystical affairs. In referring to that, one is referring to it from a context outside of it, right? So in the you're never really describing just the metaphysics of presence, so the metaphysics of part is a contextual reference to the presence. The presence always has at least a little bit of a foothold in this other space, insofar as we're discussing it or perceiving it or reflecting upon it. So I think that's an interesting place, because for me, there's anywhere between minimal and maximal overlap, but you're always dealing with intercontextuality if you're dealing with anything whatsoever, even the thing that seems the most obvious and basic to you. One of the things that stood out to me is, when I was reflecting on that argument about the rules of chess, is that there is a way in which you could say that's phenomenologically present, right? Which is to say, I heard about the rules of chess from someone, or I experientially encountered things that ended up being describable by the rules of chess. And I don't think that diminishes the argument that Wilber's making, because I think with the quadrants and also with the 8 methodological zones, the reason they're fundamental is because each of them could describe all of the others in its own style. And that's what makes them a reliable methodological mode. So it's not that it doesn't count, because you could also say, well, isn't that all phenomenology? You could say that. That's why phenomenology is on the grid. But you could also say it's all structuralism, or you could also say it's all materialism.
Exactly. Yeah. And that, I think in thinking about the intercontextuality of things, and this is a little bit of a side inquiry, but it's carrying over from last discussion, Excerpt C, and into this one, because he regularly talks about the relationship of the thou and the we, and where is the you in relationship to the we, as opposed to an it. And one of the things that he regularly says is that any you is found necessarily within the envelope of a we. And some postmodernists and post-structuralists will resist that and say that the thou actually either precedes or at least escapes that including we. And there's some tension there because there's an ethical component to that there's a kind of existential confrontation that you have with the thou, in that you're meeting the sentient being whole on another presence that can impinge on you outside of your own meaning-making space, and that it can lay moral and other kinds of imperatives on you that can rupture your own sense of what the world is about, and open it up in different ways. My sense here is that we're talking about that a you inhabits a boundary zone that like a Venn diagram. There's like a luminous boundary space and adjacency point where thou to thou we encounter each other, and to the degree that there's at least enough of an overlap that I can see that there's another presence here, that's enough to establish the we. It doesn't mean that the whole of the other being is encompassed within our we space, but that we exceed each other's apprehension of the we-ness. But there has to be at least some overlap for that to even happen, for me to be able to perceive you as a thou, as something with an interior, something that can make, lay moral and existential imperatives upon me.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question here, because I tend to favor gradient models, right, in which we might find these things arrayed, we'd find a you somewhere on a spectrum between an it and an I and a me. Wilber talks that way a lot, but because the model is segmented, he also has to describe it in terms of these relatively independent zones. And that makes it a little bit tricky. And so he makes this argument that a you only exists with the dignity of a you insofar as it shares a we, right? And that makes a lot of sense, right? It even fits sort of ethically, which is, I could treat you as a worthless piece of shit, right? The you could be thing-like, or the you could be something that shares an essential dignity and relationship with me. So insofar as the you has any ethical weight, it's because it's on the we side. And he's making that argument, which is fine. But it sort of overlooks the weirdness of the you occupying a role that seems to be halfway between an it and a we. And the fact that it occupies that in-between space should, I think, suggest to us that we might be dealing with a gradient of things rather than these segmented zones. And that's more how I would look at it personally. But I think Wilber makes a pretty compelling argument about why the dignity of the you actually obtains within the we.
Right. Yeah, I think that the dignity of the you, in a sense, can't even be acknowledged or recognized without at least some of that overlap. Some of that gradient overlap there, that there's enough of a resonance that you can even perceive that thing as a being with presence and subjectivity and agency and whatever.
Yeah, the two places I would push back, because I think a lot of people attack Wilber on this point. Of the tiny subset of people that are aware that he made this point, some of them push back on it. And the pushback is, on the one side, this gradient argument that I would make. But on the other side, I think an argument more in line with your work on grammatological modes, particularly the adverbial, which is there's a qualitative difference. There's a different flavor to how I behold a thou to how I experience a we. And I think
Right.
that's a pretty legitimate argument for pushback. But also, I think a lot of the basic pushback of people saying, well, this doesn't secure and dignify and promote the I-thou relationship. I think it does. It promotes the thing that makes the I-thou relationship valuable. So I want to give Wilber full credit, even though I would personally push back on some of this.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah. While we're in this maybe set of asides, I had one other kind of side question that relates to something that we discussed a little bit in Excerpt C, where he sometimes talks about each of the quadrants as its own holon, or even the zones as its own holon. And then sometimes he talks about them as dimensions of a holon. And so in discussing taking integral or interior perceptions in our own awareness as objects, looking a little bit more objectively at them, Wilber says, it's seeing an interior holon from without or from outside of its boundaries, which is what happens when I approach it as an object of my subject. Note, however, that there are not merely subjects and objects, but there are first persons and third persons. And what that does seem to suggest is that when I am taking a zone 2 approach to my own thoughts and feelings and internal experiences, that I am looking at those holons from the outside. That's where that language leads. And I don't think he always actually theoretically leans in that direction, but the language seems to incline in that direction. And I was thinking about it because of some of the arguments in object-oriented ontology, whether they argue for the reality of thoughts, meaning that thoughts do have causal effects in the world and things like that. But they also treat thinking and feeling, for the most part, as part of the endostructure of an object, rather than being objects themselves. They're parts of the relationships that help constitute the object, but by themselves, they don't have the full ontological completeness to be an object in themselves. So it's kind of an open question, because I could look in both directions. I can experience thoughts as part of the endostructure of a holon, part of the matrix that gives rise to the overall constitution of a holon. But at the same time, there are some interior structures that seem to have their own, at least semi-autonomy, subpersonalities and things like that, that do seem to have something of a holonic behavior, an object-like existence. I just was curious about your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I approach the grid, the Wilber lenses, is as modes of approach that can apply to all the content of all the other zones. So, right, you could treat the fact that you could treat, say, feelings more like an object or more like some additional epiphenomenon of an object, I think suggests that there is something, or it would suggest, at least to Wilber, that there's a boundary there between two different kinds of approach, and then you could switch between either one. It may be that if we want to say that my feelings or my psychology contains elements that are object-like, we might want to call those virtual objects or something like that if we were in discussion with an object-oriented ontologist. Right. I think it's important to afford ourselves the option of seeing these things in an object-like sense in order to open up the broadest possible set of interpretations of the data. Just like I think, one of the things that the notion of the subtle domain affords us is the possibility that qualia are not subjective, but are objects of a subtle kind. And we may want to tease those apart. Now, it might turn out we don't want to tease those apart, but we have the option afforded to us if we allow ourselves to deploy the object lens very broadly to all phenomena, just like we have more options available to us if we deploy the subjective lens extremely broadly. I think we should deploy all of them as broadly as possible and work back from there rather than preemptorily limit the sets of interpretations that are available to us in our model building.
Right. And there's a difference, it seems, between whether you can look at something in object fashion or whether it seems to exhibit in itself all of the characteristics that typically define a holon or an object. In other words, you can hold it in a particular way, but does it in itself, in its emergence and passage, exhibit those characteristics? And I think it's, to me, it's not a wholly decided thing, but it's an interesting question. And I know that there's this kind of continued ambiguity in the way that Wilber speaks, because sometimes he'll say, that really the holon has the four quadrants, and those are just aspects of a holon. And other times he'll treat each quadrant as its own holon or sub-holon. And yeah, I think both work, but the latter approach can lead to some confusion. He also says, for instance, the structuralism is the study of the behavior of an interior holon. So then the question is it the study of the behavior of an interior holon or the study of the interior behavior of a holon? And so that's the same, kind of endostructure question. And he seems to lean in the latter direction when he says that structuralism is an elucidation of the internality codes of a holon. In that case, he's not treating those things as objects in themselves, but the internality codes of a holon.
There's something I want to come back to on that, but first I want to say that I think this is one of the reasons why proximity gradient type thinking is necessary, because you could say there are more or less adequate objects, right? So if we imagine the object perspective zone as having a kind of magnet, and you've sprinkled these iron filings out, they're going to array toward it, but some of them might be in one of the other zones, but they're further away. They're not as adequately object-like, but they still can be somewhat object-like, right? They still have some kind of functional proximity relationship to the object interpretation zone. And I think this is something that we really have to assume there's something like a gradient between internal and external and interior and exterior, and sort of think of that as one big, I've been calling them metathemes lately. These are the chunks, and the chunks are a reciprocal two-ended gradient of some kind, rather than the chunks are split in the middle into two different fundamental zones, which can then be looked at from the inside and the outside.
Right.
So that's where I tend to be on that. But a thing that came up for me when you were saying that is, there's a sort of assumption in this, because Wilber talks about it all through first, second, and third person perspectives, that the third person perspective is sort of homogeneously being applied. And I'm not sure that's the case, because there's a more upper left, upper right kind of third person and a more lower right kind of third person. Right. I think and I want your feedback on this, is it seems to me there might be a difference between looking at the system or the code of how I experience or how we experience, and say a jnana yoga routine where I am gazing, as it were, at the essence of the self, right? Where I'm treating the subjective as a single object versus treating the subjective as a dynamic system. That would seem to be two different kinds of third person gaze on that interior.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. And you could say that really it's taking either a zone 2 or zone 4 approach to the subject, whether you're looking at it as, an abiding substance, in its singular presentation, or if you're looking at its dynamic internal activity, where you then are taking more of a intersubjective or at least a systemic look at the self, where that way you're imagining that even that the 4 quadrants can be used, or the 8 zones all can be used to look at something like the self.
Yeah, and for me, I think there's an unexplored problematization of the way Wilber's presenting it, which is this just a fractal reiteration of the third person onto the first and second person? Or is there some other dimension that would need to be taken into account in order to make these distinctions? All right. And so are we just doing third person on the left-hand side? Or are there, if there's some other axis involved, which is where my instinct tells me to look, although I don't have a great coherent argument for it yet. If there's some other axis, that axis might split the zones, or it might require the zones to be produced in a different way such that they could each be applicable to the interiors and exteriors on this map. And I'm not sure would be afforded by the way that Wilber's doing it with first, second, and third person perspectives, although it's brilliant and amazing, and there's huge potential in the way that he's doing it.
Right. Yeah, I remember you asking that question in Excerpt C, and I didn't really have a good answer for it. I have an intuition that it's not merely fractal, that we could see that it's an orthogonal kind of move to the layout there. In a way, it's looking kind of at surface and depth, or distance and immediacy, something like that. Or maybe there's a temporal dimension, because the reason I hesitated to answer it last time, and I'm still not quite sure now, is I don't know how to name that axis, but I can see different things involved. For instance, there's a temporal distance between the phenomenological and the structural apprehension, where in zone 1, you are basically experiencing something in a very narrow, time frame, in a sense of immediacy or immediate presence. Whereas zone 2 is, as Wilber says, phenomenology plus history. It's returning again and again to that phenomenon over time to notice patterns that present themselves over that timeline that are not immediately apparent in the now apprehension, right? So there's that temporal distance that's necessary, the long temporal longitudinal look that opens up that as a territory for exploration. So there could be a time element to what's going on here, to perceive the structure in that way. There could be, surface and depth doesn't quite get it, because you can also say that surface and depth kind of relates closely enough to interior and exterior. I don't know. What do you think? What do you think about the temporal side of that?
I love the temporal thing. I'm glad that you surfaced it. I would add that what I'm not sure of is that whether within and without of a boundary is the same as interior and exterior. So that's a place I would look a little bit, but the temporal really interests me, because if I imagine a range, a temporal gradient, right? And at one end is the maximum possible temporal distance, right? It's let's say the Hubble sphere, right? Beyond this point, no signals that get to you will matter because it will take too long. And then phenomenology, in the way Wilber describes it, is the minimum possible temporal distance, not to say zero,
right,
but the minimum, right? And then you could divide that somewhere along that gradient and say, on this side, we're going to call this subjective because it's fast enough to be called subjective. And in between somewhere is, like you were saying, the rules of chess are historically instantiated, or the dynamic pattern of an unfolding self. Freud is looking at the maturation of a psyche as a subjective dynamic system, right? So there's these different temporal gradients being manifested on some spectrum. And I think that's a really interesting way to do it. And I almost think Wilber's trying to go there because he so frequently describes the phenomenological, both personally and intersubjectively, as immediacy. He describes it in explicitly temporal terms on multiple occasions in these excerpts. So I'm wondering if he's groping his way toward using time as a distinguishing factor in this regard.
Right. Yeah, that one feels the closest to me. And again, why I hesitated on that is that it doesn't play as much of a immediately obvious role, though it may still be there on the right-hand quadrant side, of the zones there. I think to some degree you can still see that. Yeah, maybe we can explore that a little bit, but it's definitely very apparent where whether you're dealing with in the upper left, the I, then, that's basically dealing with something in its relative immediacy. And there are certain things that are apparent in that time window that you can describe, but there are other dimensions to it that don't disclose themselves within that short window. And you need, if you're in zone 1 of the upper left, then you've got that narrower window. Whereas zone 2, you're tracking that subject over time. You're watching their decisions. You're listening to their reasoning. You're hearing and mapping their value decisions and that sort of thing, and looking for both patterns and then changes in those patterns and any directionality in the changes of those patterns. And that's where you're able to then discern or at least hypothesize that certain structures and rules are present or active. And that acts, whether you're looking in the upper left at developmental structuralism, or in the lower left in anthropology or neo-structuralism or other things like that.
It's very similar to applying the third person to the first person to say we're going to apply the lens of mediacy to relative immediacy. Because the thing is, like, if we look at Einstein, he's using time to redefine everything. He's using time as an intrinsic factor of space. Space itself is temporally bound, but also physics, the external, the definition of the exterior is entirely those things, the changes that can be conveyed by signals within a certain time limit. Otherwise, they don't apply, right? And he's ruled out simultaneity. And so it's everything from not quite simultaneous to not quite infinite. And that's the definition of the physical universe, is all the energy exchanges within that time frame, which is all mediacy. So if that's the basic external approach, then if it's applied back to the internal, then you get something like looking at our internal structures as occurring and emerging over different timescales. So that's a very similar move to what Wilber's doing by applying the objective to the interior.
There's an experiment I did years ago. It's a little bit different from what we're saying here, but maybe not too much. I've done, several videos on our channel on the time-space knowledge vision. And many years ago, I was trying to look at what is the time-space knowledge of the 4-quadrant map. And my idea at that time, and the way I characterized it, is that the open space of each quadrant is space. That's the clearing in which phenomena manifest. The diagonal lines on each side, on each quadrant, that show the unfolding of forms is basically the creative thrust of time and the temporal extension. And then the actual lines of the quadrant, the plus, is knowledge. That's the gesture that differentiates forms of knowing.
I would have to, and I would like to take some time to think through this from the adjacency perspective, because I've been trying to think about root forms of adjacency, as you know, in the next two, as essentially what the contexts that give rise to time and space thinking. Because I'm very interested in the work of people like Stephen Wolfram, who think they have a computational model in which basically space and time are outputs of the model, which is great for physics, but all still presupposes there's a sequential unfolding of the computation and something like a locational arena in which computations can be presented. So
Right.
there's still a minimal space and time. All right. And are those the two most basic forms of adjacency? Are they present in all other subsequent modes of proximity? And is there some logic or reason why proximity would take these two forms?
Right.
And so, yeah, could I apply that to this? Maybe I could, but I'd have to sit down and work on that.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the TSK approach, is not to negate time or space, but basically to talk about them in different degrees or modes. And great space or great time is at their, you could say their most fundamental, or also their most intense forms, where they also seem the least time-like or the least space-like. But anyway, that's a sideline for what we're discussing here. But yeah, I want to keep it as an open question in terms of if there's another axis that we're really looking at with the zones. But a hit immediately for me is that there seems to be possibly this temporal element.
Yeah, I agree very much. I think there's a temporal issue here at a very fundamental level. A couple of other things that I noticed in this text that struck me that aren't just about structuralism and the look of the interior from the exterior and why Foucault justifies that. And there's if you haven't read this, there's a huge long section of Wilber exploring Foucault. And it's really worth having a look at, because his appreciation of Foucault and the postmodernists is on display here as much as anywhere else in his writings. There's some discussion in this about wholes and wholeness, and how perspectives are always encountering wholenesses, but the implicit wholeness becomes the explicit content when you get up to a certain level of sophistication in your cognitive processing. So the world that the explicit world of wholeness is being co-enacted, as opposed to the implicit worlds of wholeness. And that's great. I can kind of go with that. But the thing that struck me there was the difference between saying wholes and wholenesses, right? It's intriguing, because I think a lot about this production of excess coherence as a necessary feature in establishing a greater level or a greater depth of any kind. And that has a certain open-ended qualitative feature, right? The quality of the wholeness can be produced in a way that's different than thinking about a whole thing just is there, right? And that seems to be a natural extension of the perception to perspective switch that Wilber's talking about in this. And I wondered if you had any thoughts around building a system on wholes versus building a system on wholenesses.
That's interesting that you bring that up, because that also stuck out to me in this reading. And I was thinking about that. One of the things that caught my attention is he said, you don't perceive a whole without taking a third person perspective. That's necessary for the perception of holism and of wholes. And that made me think about the mystical claims through the depth of interior first-person perspective to encounter and realize the fundamental wholeness of being. And that would seem to maybe contradict what he's saying. But one of the ways that I would approach it is, it depends on, you can build up different kinds of, of models of wholeness, a mereology that looks at like a holonic model that looks at objects that can function both as a whole in itself, something that is self-contained and has a boundary, and it's functionally, whole. It's an integrated entity that is self-consistent to enough degree that it can be counted as a whole. And that's valuable, and that's definitely a legitimate thing that you can do. But I was thinking about somebody like Henry Bortoft, a Goethean philosopher, and his discussion of the difference between artificial or counterfeit and authentic wholes. And a counterfeit whole is any whole that you can basically lay out in space and look at. The only authentic whole, he says, is an active absence. You can encounter the authentic whole through the bodying forth of the parts. And it's basically going deeply into any part that you can get the intuitive feel for the whole, but it never shows up as one object laid aside another object. That those are always going to be partial or never, the whole. So again, that's maybe a little bit different. It's talking about the difference between the whole and individual wholes or holons, which are always wholes and parts, and that can be laid alongside each other. It would seem then that it's through the interior disciplines that you can encounter what he would call the authentic whole, and through the third person methodologies that you could begin to map out what he calls counterfeit wholes, but we might not necessarily pejoratively frame them and just, talk about them as holons.
The way you describe him saying that, I think, is very consonant with the quadrivia kind of discussion, right? That I can look into any of the methodological zones and find things that appear to be functioning as wholes, but they are in the subdomains of the wholeness that I am, right? That this, whatever I am right now, includes my physical perception, includes the physical regime, the external regime, the internal regime, the interpersonal regime. That's all subsets of the holon, which is present as an absence, which in the sense of it's not one of the things in one of the zones. So I think that's kind of explicit in Wilber. I'm also interested in this, as you know, I often think in terms of a coaxial model, where I might, you might think of the accretion of more inclusive or more diverse whole things as moving along a horizontal axis. And I might think of degrees of wholeness as operating semi-independently of that, right? Because I can add a range of complexity and recognize a greater diversity of types of patterns, and then I can grow to stabilize that. And it is as if I am a greater whole than I was before. But at any step in that process, I can be more or less whole in terms of exhibiting wholeness. Right, I can have greater or lesser coherence of some quasi-homogeneous quality that's distributed among my parts and organizes them. Right, so it seems to me those are somewhat independently moving variables, which only come into play if wholeness is thought of as slightly different than a whole.
That makes sense, and he doesn't say exactly that, but he's looking, I think, in a similar direction when he talks about structuralism, zone 2 approaches, studying structures, and every structure is a whole. It's something with a boundary and an interior and in various internality codes and patterned behaviors, and it's self-maintaining and self-transforming. It exhibits different characteristics of holons or wholes. So every structure is a whole, but he would say not every structure is consciously holistic, and not everybody operating from any one of those structures is necessarily perceiving wholes or consciously enacting holistic embrace of phenomena. And that there are variations in that you could say that anyone operating from any structure is enacting some kind of whole, but with greater or lesser degrees of self-awareness of that, and greater and lesser degrees of inclusiveness.
Yeah, and I think that's I touched on it earlier, the sense of one of the ways he articulates integral levels of worldview is that they are explicitly whole oriented as opposed to implicitly whole-oriented. And I think there's probably an interesting complementarity between, on the one hand, thinking about models that describe the experience of people who are primarily wholes encountering wholes, and approaches like with the integration surplus model that say, hey, all of the approaches at these levels are approaches that are actually trying to generate the wholeness quality, whether or not there's a whole involved or not. I think those are, a right and a left hand of the same kind of vision logic space that's being mapped out here.
Right. I like that sense of the excess delivering in some way that wholeness quality. It's something that's felt. It's something that can't necessarily be pinned down or mapped. That's the excess part of it. It's this excess coherence that you can feel it as an active absence, holding everything together in a sense, or actualizing everything. But it's not something that you can lay out in the phenomenal field as another object necessarily.
There's a thing I want to touch on about this segment because it has, this text has one of my favorite philosophical takes on consciousness. And I think there's a lot of integrally informed people who still have a habit of associating consciousness with the so-called upper left, the subjective experience zone. And Wilber has many times been clear that he means by consciousness the general altitude, the depth and or height that is applicable to all of the zones, interior, exterior, singular or plural. And he touches on that in this document in a really interesting way where he says, how does it go? If I have 6 meters of wood, consciousness is the 6 meters, not the wood. And that's a really intriguing way to put it, right? Consciousness is the context. It's the measure of the phenomenon. It's not the phenomenon being measured, right? We don't want to reify consciousness, at least in Wilber's take, right? Consciousness isn't something you have. It's something by which you evaluate whatever you have. The thing that is evaluated for its consciousness is not consciousness. Consciousness is the evaluation metric. And that's a potentially radical and very useful and very interesting approach that I don't think is appreciated even in the community where we still think of consciousness as a subjective property.
Right. Or as some kind of ontological substance.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that section is really interesting. And there's something to it where that can play into, some of the apprehensions of the emptiness of consciousness, emptiness and clarity of consciousness, and that it's not a thing in itself. And the clarity dimension it's what affords the accounting, the degreed accounting that you were just describing.
One of the questions I had last time, and it's still on my mind, is about the sourcing of a we, because Wilber talked last time about, what you have to do to an it to make it into a we, right? And it might pass through a you and a thou on its way to becoming a we. And I like that transit gradient. It's very, very much the way I think about things. But in this section, he also comes back again and again to when something is a we and when something is an it and how it might move between those. And you could stop having something in common with someone and they would fall back into the we. They've been dehumanized. Or you can start to grow and establish some kind of shared hermeneutic viability to the other person who's an, even if you think they're another person, you're still treating them as an it. You haven't noticed until you've segued them into a we. But the question I had last time was, is he saying this is where we's come from? Do we's start as its that are increasingly modified by their inclusion in a hermeneutic circle? Or do we's evolve out of lower we's, just like subjects evolve out of lower subjects, or objects evolve out of more primitive objects? Right? Where is the sourcing of the we? Is it a modification of an it? Or is it something that grows and enfolds other we's?
That's a good question. And I don't know if I have a good, clear, unambiguous answer on that. There are a couple things I look at the same time. One, if you think about Martin Buber and his I, thou, and I, it relationships, the way he treats them, it's almost adverbial, it's modal. There's the I, it relationship, and there's the I, thou relationship. And it's not only a difference in the objects, but there's a difference in the subject. The I that is beholding and relating to an it is not the same I that's beholding and relating to a thou. So they're different modes, and I don't know if there needs to be any necessary privileging of sequences in any given perceptual situation. But if you look at developmental sequences, or if you look at just AQUIL itself, maybe there is some priority overall. For instance, Wilber says that all the quadrants go all the way down. And so that would mean even at very primitive levels of experience and encounter, holon to holon, there would be both the potential for I, it, and I, we relations, all the way up. And Sloterdijk, he doesn't go all the way down like that in the cosmic scale, but even in terms of human development, he would argue that the human subject, the emerging subject, always emerges at least dyadically, and that there's a primordial we, that the bubble of the individual psyche is always at least dyadic, and even in the womb, the infant is relating to the placenta and the sound of mother's voice, and there's always this relationality in which the I is taking shape, and so there's a we field in which I and thou and I and it are gradually emerging. So that's one way that you can look at that. And looking at object relations theory, there's the idea that initially when the infant is born and is relating to the mother, the infant doesn't relate to the whole mother as a you or a thou, but typically focuses on an object like the breast, and there's a more of an I-it utilitarian relationship. I don't know if that perspective really fully holds anymore. I know there's been a number of recent studies where it's demonstrated that the infant can register and respond positively and intersubjectively and with some warmth to the mother's face and voice very early on. So yeah, I don't have a clear answer if there's any priority. I think once the I, it, and the I, thou are established as available modes of relating, I think there can be a toggling back and forth that doesn't necessarily need to be sequential. But in terms of the overall emergence of perspectives for any individual subject, it's more slippery. And I don't know if I have a definite place where I stand on that yet.
I don't have a conclusive statement on that, but it seems like you could tell a number of different stories. Your example of the infant was interesting because there's a way in which there's a latent self-experience nested within an intersubjective experience where the emergence of the it, right? You're sort of fused with the mother and the breast. And then you go, oh, that's the mother or the breast. Now I've created an it. And by creating that it, I'm able to then distinguish an I from a we, right? So, but that's an example of a different sequence, right? You could start with an it and move to a we. You could start with a we and move through an it to get a we and an I, right? I think that's one of the reasons we've got to relatively stabilize a notion of these different zones, because you could track through them in almost any combination. One of the things that came up for me just now was the notion, and this goes to a lot of your work on grammatology, is one of the things Wilber's doing in these excerpts is creating hybrid grammatical units. right? So to go beyond what we might call the as and the with and the at and the via or whatever. So if phenomenology, or let's say my earlier example, if I'm doing a jnana yoga practice where I'm trying to steadily contemplate the root of the I, I'm looking at how I'm looking as.
Mm-hmm.
And that's different than talking about how I'm looking as. And so there's an at as, and an about as, and there's a possibility of a whole field of these compound grammatical modes that might be something that Wilber is pressing into with his methodological pluralism.
Yeah, I think the grammatical lens could give an interesting way to open that up. And I was thinking that that's something that we could touch on here, is the differentiation he makes between structuralism, zone 2, and systems theory or autopoetics, whether it's the zone 8, for systems theory, or you could call it zone 4, or zone 3 for the interior autopoetic approaches. And with the easiest distinction that you could make is, with the systems approach, where basically, bringing in the math that we talked about before, structuralism is 3p times 1p, and systems approach is 3p times 3p, or third person plural even, where what you're doing with systems theory is you're just basically observing behaviors, objects, entities, interactions, and noting any patterns, any flows, any feedback loops, things like that. And so basically you're able to look and track from the purely outside abstract perspective or approach the behavior of a system. And that's different from structuralism in that you start with the 1p. And it's a 3p approach to the 1p. And so you first have to have access to the 1p, to the phenomenological or the hermeneutic. You have to be able to first traverse that kind of felt and meaning space, and then take a step back and theorize about its patterns and behaviors and underlying structures and rules and things like that. So for systems theory, you don't need to have that access to the as. You only can proceed, talking about, and don't need the direct knowledge by acquaintance. And that's one reason why he says that systems theory, while counting itself as holistic and complete, kills consciousness and culture, because it doesn't really have a way to get at and work with the 1p, with the interiors. It gets a little bit more subtle with the autopoetic approach, because that is an attempt to reconstruct, in some sense, the interiors of entities. It's what Varela calls biological phenomenology, but it doesn't require any access necessarily to the meaning space or the hermeneutic space of of the entity in order to do the tracking. It's more, you could say, reconstructive and speculative. You don't have to dialogue with somebody or read something or phenomenologically inspect something in your own consciousness. You only need to look at the structures of the entity and the environment and the structural coupling between them, and you can extrapolate from there what kind of things the bacterium detects. What's going on, how do the systems interact in the enactment of a particular world space that you can theorize, but you're doing it all from a third person perspective, and you don't need that first person checking in order to build an accurate or at least a workable representation.
Yeah, but when we add, say, levels to it, then I think there's a sense in which there's an implicit presence of the 3P of 1P in all of the domains, right? Whereas, just like we might make a joke that Freud's model of the human psyche is fairly distorted by Freud's experience of his own psyche.
Right.
Right. Similarly, we might say that anybody's ability to describe objective systems or neurophenomenology, or to try to understand what someone else is going through or build any kind of model, is based in large part, if it's a successful model, on their implicit experience of the sophistication of their own psyche that gives them a grounding for reading the meaning out of those other zones. And I don't think that necessarily challenges anything you were saying, but I bring it up because I'm very interested in how correlations between the zones are a necessity to facilitate the developmental depth of any of these procedures, so that you have to have a kind of 3P knowledge of your 1P that's pretty good in order to accept that to make sense of patterns in any of the other methodological zones.
Right. Yeah, I think we were getting at that earlier also, where really you can't fully tease apart. This is the idea of the tetranaction. You can't really tease apart any of these quadrants or zones, and that they are, if they're not explicit, they are implicit. So I think that's a great point, that you probably aren't going to be a good biological phenomenologist or autopoietic theorizer without good access to your own interior, and good familiarity with what it is to be a conscious being. So that's implicit. It just doesn't show up explicitly in the methodology, but it is, you could say, implicit in all of them are implied. And there is this hybridizing quality. And I know Benita Roy produced a paper some years ago looking at the zone model, 100 or 200 years in the future, and where we've gone from that. And she did this further hybridization among different zones to bring out different kinds of territories. I remember I had a dialogue a while back with someone else who was a little bit concerned that not all of the disciplines associated with the zones appeared to be pure exemplars of primordial perspectives. A lot of the different disciplines that are associated with the zones actually function as kinds of hybrids of different zonal perspectives together. And the way that they interact and play together is what gives the architecture for that kind of discipline. So it's not really easy, if you're looking at any advanced discipline, to look at any one of the zones or any one of the quadrants and find a method that relies exclusively on one of those or quadrant territories. And I think that's also partly where someone like Latour is going with his inquiry into modes of existence. And one of his ideas is that any major human discipline doesn't sit exclusively in its own magisterial domain, that it consists of a braiding of multiple modes, and the style of the braiding is what and the interweaving of those different modes is what helps you enact that particular theoretical space.
Yeah, it seems like there's two things there. One is overlapping between the zones, fuzziness at the boundaries, and the other one is if you intersect these zones with another metatheme. This is the first public time I'm using that word. The metatheme of developmental, more or less structural complexity, let's say, then if it requires hybridization to create increasing depth, then each gradation along that other metatheme will express more and more collaboration between the zones that you would find at any given level. right? So that's a way in which we can say, yes, for all practical purposes, it's a blending and convergence and overlapping of these zones that shows up in anything that is meaningful enough to be interesting to us. But that doesn't mean these zones aren't really good ways of dissecting the phenomenon. We can assume that their convergence reflects another dissection of phenomenon.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And one thing that I wanted to touch on before, I think we're getting close to our time. So I have a kind of doozy of a question for you that you may want to pass on. First, because of some of our earlier conversation, I think it was in Excerpt C about morphic resonance and things like that. We probably could have said this earlier in the conversation, but what are structures? And Wilber kind of looks at it from multiple perspectives, and one is the patterns underlying morphic resonance, and the other is just, I think, the quantum framing that he gave, and the way to think about structures is not these clunky fixed things, but basically it's a map of a probability space, that it's more likely to see these kinds of behaviors in this area of aqual, space or space-time, but that there's not anything fixed there. There's a dynamic kind of constantly emerging where there's, like in quantum language, a tendency to exist rather than any fixed existence. There's a slant to the patterning. And looking at that, more kind of slippery way of thinking about it, I wanted to ask you, especially given some of your more recent dialogues, Wilber goes through a discussion of social development towards the end of this excerpt, and he lays out some sociographs for different levels of society and talks about the unfolding of different social orders. And I wanted to know how that landed for you after reading the Graeber-Wengrow book, The Dawn of Everything.
Yeah, Graeber-Wengrow and a number of other people have been exciting interest in the liminal web community, because I think there's some, if not challenge, at least specification of how rich the developmental models for socio-historical phenomena would have to be. And I think, I don't have a problem with how Wilber laid it out there, but it's an extreme simplification, which it's meant to be. So that's fine. But I think the levels need to be, and this is where, if I was doing the Benita Roy thing and talking 200 years from the future, there would be much more basic units that define these different levels, right? Like I might say that modernity, for example, fluctuated in human minds periodically. Athens, there was a Mesoamerican burst of astronomy and mathematics and architecture that was pretty good, and it never really locked in until we had the printing press and telescopes, polished glass lenses. Like, okay, that's a nice story, but was there something else in terms of tetrarising? Was there a different lock-in? Was there some other set of technology that locked it in at these other times? Were there native North American nations that had a kind of modernity that was on the far side of something like a dogmatic agrarian kingdom society already, and looked not technologically and in terms of the systems they described and in terms of their communication tech, very unsimilar to what the Europeans were doing at that time. So you could say, well, yes, if Wilber is correct here about applying these roughly neo-Piagetian type stages to general socio-historical levels of complexity and function among human beings, we're ultimately going to have to describe that in ways that are much more basic than the things he's using to describe them. I think if we hold them pretty roughly, I think something like those basic phases do unfold, but they unfold in such a fluctuating and variegated fashion, right? If we take all the modes by which a level can manifest and all of the healthy or unhealthy ways it can do that, and all of the ways it can grow up and also fall back. And also, as Jeremy Johnson's very interested, the ways in which they can cycle, that a level might be a cycling of modes within a set of variations that could then pass through multiple pathways, healthy or unhealthy, to the next layer of cycling variations that are healthy or unhealthy. That's a much richer way to look at it. But I'm pretty confident intuitively that there's going to be strong similarity between that and what Wilber is laying out here. We just have to make sure to be expected to be more organic, more messy, more fluctuating, and more variegated. But there's no reason there shouldn't be sequential dependencies of roughly the kind he's describing over the course of anthropological history, just as there is over the course of biological history.
Mm-hmm. He does make qualification in the text to indicate that when he's talking about the tribal or indigenous cultures, he means in their original manifestation, and that tribal cultures or indigenous cultures now might manifest any one of the emergent, developmental social orders and value systems. But so that meets some of the objections that, he's maybe unfairly limiting and characterizing the actual complexity and richness of existing indigenous cultures now. But I think this book opens up, further need for inquiry and unpacking about how do you account for that great variety and what are the elemental factors. I also still basically accept the legitimacy of certain forms of sequential, dependent unfoldment. So, yeah, I think we're close to our time here. Anything else that you think we should go into for this?
Not necessarily. I'm totally segued on to anthropological phases now. I think there's Wilber does a good job of noting areas where we should be careful to make sure we're not oversimplifying and conflating things. And even if you go back to Up from Eden, it's a very rich take on anthropological history. But I think where he's maybe insufficient at the contemporary moment is in sounding the alarm for certain predictable dangers in interpretation, right? The predictable danger of over-linearizing and oversimplifying the developmental models, the danger of projecting our sense of what's primitive onto people who we think are primitives, right? And that's a messy conflation that makes both of them less intelligible, right? So I think a lot of his model is going to hold over time, but I don't think he's talked about the dangers of misreading it adequately enough. And I think people like Graeber and I think people like Nora Bateson are of interest to the community because they sense we should have greater clarity on what the dangers of misreading these models are. That said, I thought this was an amazing text, right? In some of the clarity he brings to what he means by consciousness and what he means by post-metaphysics and what he means by wholeness. There's a tremendous amount of richness here that goes above and beyond any of the considerations of what a third-person perspective on a first or second-person perspective might be, even though that's extremely rich. And again, I would encourage anybody who's interested in Wilber's understanding of Foucault and the postmodernists to really take a look at this because you get a sense of what are the patterns he's seeing in these people and their theories.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think for anyone who is concerned about Wilber being anti-green or not adequately appreciative of the gifts of postmodernity and deconstruction and post-structuralism and all of that, I think in this document you will find a very sympathetic reading, and from his side, I think a great effort to take account of the lasting contributions of those approaches in anything that we do going forward. And one of the things that I feel at coming, at the end of this document and knowing what's next for us, which is Excerpt G, and that's going to be a inquiry, especially into the subtle realm and subtle energies and a few other things. But the two excerpts that are missing, excerpts E and F, which we're going to go into some of the other zones, I think look more deeply at autopoiesis and things like that, and also go into his integral semiotics. And those feel like missing elements. I really, following what we've already unpacked so far, I really would love the chance to dive into those, but maybe we'll eventually get that in the future. So what's ahead for us next is Excerpt G, and that will be his unique take on how you can relate to metaphysical realities and things like subtle energies and things like that.
I'm looking very much forward to that. I've done a lot of thinking on what subtle means in general myself. I just realized we didn't come back to the question about the look of a feeling in terms of why objective is more like optics and subjective is more like feeling, that might be an unnecessary conflation, but I'm going to sit with that. And I'm happy to bring this to a close now. It's been a fantastic discussion. I really appreciated some of the ultra abstract places we were able to go, whether the audience is with us or not. They're very enlivening for me personally.
Yeah, me too. I really enjoyed it. And as always, I look forward to our next discussion.
Yeah.
Take care.